In the heart of an aging urban neighborhood, there stood a relic of the past, a decrepit phone booth. For years, it had been ignored, forgotten by time, its glass panels fogged with grime and its receiver dangling like a noose. But as the years passed, rumors began to grow, weaving tales of strange occurrences. Residents whispered about how the booth glowed at night, an unearthly light spilling out into the darkened streets, visible from miles away. No one dared approach it, not anymore. Despite the whispers, it wasn't until a brisk November evening that Simon found himself drawn to the booth. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Stories about how the phone sometimes rang in the dead of night, a low, insistent jingle that sent shivers down spines. No one had answered it for decades, not since the incident, whatever that had been. But that night, Simon's curiosity was louder than his fear. Simon was no stranger to the unexplained. He had spent his childhood with an imagination fueled by ghost stories and urban legends. But as an adult, skepticism had dulled those edges, grounding him in the mundane. Even so, as he walked home that evening, the glow of the phone booth caught his eye, and a memory from his childhood surfaced. His mother's warnings about curiosity. "It will lead you somewhere you don't want to go," she used to say. Yet, as Simon stood before the booth, he felt a pull, a compulsion he couldn't shake. The light was mesmerizing, casting the street in an eerie, pale glow. His breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped closer, drawn by a faint hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then it rang. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade. Simon froze, his heart pounding as the phone's tinny chime echoed. For a moment, he considered walking away. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, but his feet stayed rooted, his curiosity tethering him to the spot. Before he could stop himself, he pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The interior of the booth was suffocatingly small, the walls stained and scratched. The smell of mildew and metal filled his nostrils as he reached for the receiver, the ringing louder now, almost deafening. With a shaky hand, Simon lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Silence. Then came the voice, his voice. "Simon," it said, the familiarity sending a jolt through him. The tone was steady, calm, but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "I've been waiting for you." Simon's breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer his question. Instead, it began to recount moments from his life, moments he had buried deep. The time he'd stolen money from his best friend, the argument with his father before the man's sudden death, the secrets he had never confessed, not even to himself. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper and deeper into his sense of reality. "Stop," Simon pleaded, his voice breaking. But the voice continued, relentless. Time within the booth seemed to warp. The outside world blurred, fading into an indistinct haze. The light from the booth grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with Simon's racing heart. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized he couldn't let go of the receiver. It was as if the phone had fused to his hand, binding him in place. The voice shifted, growing colder. "You've hidden from the truth for too long," it said. "But you can't hide here." Simon squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. He tried to remember the streets outside, the comforting sight of his apartment building, the mundane reality he had left behind. But all of it felt impossibly distant, as if he had crossed an unseen threshold. As the voice droned on, the booth itself seemed to change. The walls grew darker, the grime twisting into patterns that resembled faces, their hollow eyes staring at him. The air grew colder, each breath coming out in desperate, shallow puffs. And then, the voice said something that made his blood run cold. "It's your turn now." The line went dead. Simon yanked at the receiver, finally breaking free, and stumbled out of the booth. The cold night air hit him like a wave, but something was wrong. The street was silent, unnaturally so. No cars, no distant hum of the city, no footsteps, just silence. He looked around, his eyes darting to familiar landmarks. They were there, but different. The buildings seemed taller, their windows darker. The streetlights cast strange angular shadows that moved as if alive. And then he saw it, the phone booth. It was still glowing, but now it stood at the end of the block, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. Simon turned to run, but no matter where he went, the booth was always there, waiting. He tried screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Time stretched and twisted, each step feeling like an eternity. He was trapped in a nightmare with no end. Desperation took hold as Simon returned to the booth, hoping to undo whatever had been set in motion. He picked up the receiver, his hand trembling. "Hello?" he asked, his voice cracking. This time, there was no voice, just static. But as he listened closer, he realized it wasn't static at all. It was whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping and growing louder. They spoke of regret, of fear, of lives unfulfilled, and then they spoke directly to him. "You will call another." Simon dropped the receiver, his heart pounding. He stumbled back, and as he did, the booth's light dimmed. For a moment, he thought he was free. But then he saw her, a woman at the end of the street, walking towards the booth. She moved as if in a trance, her eyes fixed on the glowing light. Simon tried to shout, to warn her, but no sound came. He watched helplessly as she stepped into the booth, the door closing behind her. The glow intensified, and Simon felt a pull deep within him, as if a thread had been severed. The woman's silhouette blurred, and then the booth went dark. When Simon looked down at his hands, he saw the receiver. It was in his grip, though he had no memory of picking it up. And then, it began to ring. The sound echoed through the empty street, cold and unyielding. Simon's reflection stared back at him from the glass panel of the booth, but it wasn't his face anymore. It was the face of someone else, waiting for their turn to answer the call.